were my parents were from Czechoslovakia. Actually, my mom was born in Czechoslovakia. I was Czechoslovakia, and my dad was born in the United States, but his mother, he lived the first 19 and a half years of his life in Slovakia. And he fought in World War II. And my mom was a war bride who came over. And they impressed on me at a very early age the idea that each and every one of us is entitled to dignity and respect. They were very familiar with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. English was not either of their first languages. So, and I grew up speaking Slovak at first, but it was something that was a common part of our household discussion about the importance of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. What does it look like? What do we owe each other? My parents really encouraged this deep, thoughtful, philosophical perspective. And when I went off, I grew up in New Jersey, worked really hard to get rid of the New Jersey accent. I'm told now I have a mid-Atlantic accent. And my parents wanted me to become a lawyer. And so they pushed for me to go to law school, which I can't necessarily say that it's been a good background. Given my own choices, I'm not sure I necessarily would have gone that route. And when I went to law school, and we're talking, oh my gosh, late 70s, early 80s, when I started, women were only 25% of the class. So it was still very, very male dominated. And there was some wonder, there was some discrimination, I should say. People, out of all my professors, only one was a woman. All right. And there would be comments made sort of about, well, what are you going to law school for? And the implication being that I wouldn't use necessarily the law degree. And now by the time I graduated, it was almost up, which was, I went part-time, so it took me 4 years to get through law school. And I was also working at that time. By the time I graduated, the classes were almost 50-50. But so it happened rather rapidly. I would say between 1977 and 1981, which was when I graduated from law school, attitudes were beginning to shift, beginning to change, but they still hadn't changed a lot, especially either in the courtroom or necessarily within the profession itself. The law schools were helping to change things, but as a young woman in the legal profession, it was kind of a little dismaying at how women were treated, particularly how I would be treated sometimes. And people would make crude comments. And I would experience people touching me inappropriately. And that certainly wasn't something that was very disturbing to have to work with. But, back then, is sort of like, oh, this is just part of being a woman. And you kind of learn to put up with it. I'm not advocating for that now. I think we've come a long way. Thank goodness. But there were also other things going on in the legal profession. And I was in the legal profession for, let's see now, almost 20 years. Almost 20 years. And I call myself a recovering attorney because, Rick, you and I've had this conversation before, I think. What's legal is not always ethical, and what's ethical is not always legal. And I would find myself as a young lawyer being asked to do things that I did not think were particularly ethical, but they were considered legal. So I left after a while, and this actually relates to the question, the entire discussion here. I married my first husband, John MacDonald was his name. And we graduated from law school. And a few years later, we were planning to get married. And he was diagnosed with acute acute myelocytic leukemia. And he was 33 and I was in 26, maybe 27. And back then, hospice wasn't even a thing, or it was barely a thing. I just learned about it. And there were a couple of things that happened that arose out of that situation. First, I wasn't taken seriously by his doctors when I asked about hospice. They dismissed it out of hand. They said, oh, no. He cannot go home. He cannot be, hospice is giving up, and we're not giving up on him. Now, being a young lawyer, I'm sorry that I was sorry that I didn't have the knowledge or the strength necessarily to fight back at that time. And so unfortunately died in the hospital a few months later of sepsis. And it was always one of my regrets that I wasn't able to bring him home. And I realized around that time that, okay, the legal profession here, what good is it? What am I doing? And then in one of those things that happens in life, I think that is more than coincidence sometimes, I ended up doing Rhode Island's first end-of-life decision-making case. Mm-hmm. And a family came to me and said, we know that you know what it's like to lose someone you love. My wife is in a persistent vegetative state, and we would like to have life support withdrawn. And in her instance, it was a feeding tube. And Jack, my first husband, had refused a feeding tube. So you can imagine. Oh, and I also said we'd like to bring her home to die, and hospice was becoming a bit more well-known at that time. So you can imagine it was redemptive in a sense that I was able to help this family in a way that I couldn't help Jack. I learned from my lessons. And so I ended up doing Rhode Island's first end-of-life decision-making case. There weren't statutory laws around. It was all based on case law at that time. And we won the case. It was the Marcia Gray case. It was Gray versus Romeo. That was the case. And it was at that time I said, this is what after we won the case, and I started doing pro bono work in terms of bioethics, ethics, fighting for the underdog. And I thought to myself, all right, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Not necessarily litigating car accidents, slips and falls, divorces, things like that, but to be helping people to have a voice. And if they can't speak for themselves, have their loved ones be able to speak on their behalf. And so I went back to school. So we won the case. And I thought to myself, all right, now how do I make this transition? I went back to school. I since remarried, married to the same guy now for 35 years. No more husbands after this. This is it. So I went back to, and a wonderful guy. But that's one of the reasons I go by MacDonald, and it's an homage to my first husband. My husband's name now is Kim Glenn. So and he's been wonderfully supportive. But when I went back to school, so after this, when I realized, my heart is not being in a litigator, a lawyer, where people are not necessarily concerned about the ethical issues. I went back to school at McGill in Canada and got my degree in bioethics, and that was back in 2002. So wow, 20 years ago. And since then, I've been teaching, and I've thought a lot about these questions that you've asked, Rick. And the question that resonates most with me is how do we create dialogues? How do we create dialogues to help connect with one another? Because the bigger questions, like how do we create a more just, fair, equitable society? That's like trying to swallow the ocean a little bit. So the best that I can do, anyway, is to try and break it down and connect with individuals and the community. And I love what you're doing here, because what you're doing here is helping people to connect through their stories and build a community that way. We're all human. We all have similar shared experiences. And I think that through sharing our stories, that it's a way to depolarize some of the discussions we've been having. And I love what you said earlier too about your mom and love. And as I transitioned from being a practicing to an academic and philosopher, what does love look like? I know what it looks like to me. Okay, kindness, respect, treating people with dignity, and that's part of the story. That's part of it's the story of growth. It's the story of overcoming hardships. And I think sometimes we have to go through hell before, we can figure out what we ourselves can contribute to this discussion. So
wow. That's a little snippet of your life story. I'm struck by several things. One was learning from the experience of of dealing with a paternalistic medical system that didn't allow the voice of the patient and the family to be heard, and then transitioning from law into ethics as a means of creating the opportunities for people to be able to advocate for themselves more effectively. I just have a quick question, and if Andrew has a question, I'll let him chime in as well. Where do you think your advocacy came for supporting the underdog? Not everyone does that work. So where do you think that arose from?
I think it arose from my parents, okay, because like I said, my dad fought in World War II. English was not my first language growing up. And I have to say, I guess I felt like my family, they struggled. They were perceived as immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
They were immigrants, but they worked so hard and loved this country so much that when people would hurl insults at them or at me, why does somebody stand up and say, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to let the bully do that?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's because I had experienced that. I had experienced the discrimination and the bullying. And you know what? I finally grew up and found my voice and, feel like, okay, you know what? I'm going to do whatever I can to stop that, to intervene.
Mm-hmm.
And having to do that with love.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit, it's not easy, okay? Because as a lawyer, I was trained to fight. I was a warrior.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please.
I'm just curious. To what extent have you, sort of done a deep dive into, writing up and sharing your story as you're doing now? I mean, have you written anything up like this, or done a deep dive into your own life history and shared it with others through your opportunities of teaching, or is that not something that's been discussed very much?
No. Let me put it this way. I guess in my writings, I mean, I've written about the end of life experiences, with my first husband and others. I've written about my advocacy. All right. But no, I haven't necessarily shared my background story in terms of, in terms of, say, writing a book or anything like that. I think it often shows through my articles. I describe the experience with my first husband. But, those personal aspects, those aspects about what it was like to be a woman during that time, a female attorney who really, had to kind of stand up and fight for themselves and counter to. No, you know what? I haven't written about that. And go ahead.
No, but the reason why I say that is because, I think, it's almost like a little bit of a taboo to go into this level of, personal storytelling and linking it to your own professional development. It's sort of, from my perspective, I think it's incredibly important, and yet we don't allow people to give voice and permission to do that. And part of let me just say something about my background, because I was trained as a family physician, but I also did early in my career, I did family therapy training and did, 3 years of training or whatever. And part of that actually was going through and telling your own family of origin story, putting up your genogram, talking about your relationships with your different, family members and whatever. But it wasn't necessarily linked to the professional development. And I just think there's so much that can be learned by people writing short stories, or longer if they want to, about it, because it provides a sort of a sort of life trajectory of where people end up and why. And you've described several things, and I'm sure there's much more than under the hood than we've already spoken to about why people become advocates for fairness. And sometimes it's driven by the fact that you weren't treated so fairly, and you feel like this has got to change. The problem is we don't tell our stories. And I just wanted to let Andrew, if he's still listening, he may be too distracted if he's driving, but I'm quite happy, Andrew, for you to chime in if you feel so inclined with your interest in equity. I'm quite happy to continue the conversation. But given that Andrew's listening, you're more than welcome to chime in if you like.
And Hassan's back too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm here. I'm not going to be able to be here too much longer. I apologize. I have an appointment.
That's okay.
But I appreciate it. It's interesting. I'm also a lawyer, and I attended law school in 2000, and when I was 30 years old. And in that year, it was the first year in the United States that there were more women than men attending law school.
I remember that.
To see that sort of transition. I just wanted to kind of share that note. And as far as my origin story, I don't know if you were asking that or not. I don't know. I think I need to think about that a little bit more. I grew up in a fairly religious, faith-based family, Christian tradition, and so I think just that was kind of part of what and how I was raised. So, treat people with love and respect and honor. And so I guess that's really where it comes from for me. I guess that's all I have to say at the moment. But I do have to get going here, and I apologize. Thank you.
No, that's no problem. I just want to thank you for pumping in. Just giving, this is just to put this a little bit in context. I'm trying to develop the idea of developing what I'm calling an equity story movement, where people do share their stories. And I just don't think that a lot of these stories ever see the light of day. And I think if you don't share the stories, a lot of wisdom gets lost. And it actually, from my point of view, goes against the grain. It's not something that people are given permission or encouraged to do. But unless we do this, I think it's very unlikely that we're ever going to shift the needle on equity unless people are willing to share their experiences, what they learned from it, and to redress the injustices of the past, which is something, Linda, you did. And I'm sure there's a lot more and you could speak about it. But, Hassan, I know you were speaking earlier. If you want to chime in on anything, you're more than welcome to. Sorry, I can't hear you. You have to unmute. That's okay.
Sorry. I was
That's
listening
okay.
to Linda before I left, and she said something. She lives in New Jersey, because I lived in Cherry Hill for a while, and because I used to commute to Philadelphia, Drexel University. My two aunts lived in Cherry Hill on Route 70, and I used to go there a lot. I love Cherry Hill, love New Jersey, and I've lived there for about 10 years before moving back.
Oh, neat. That's wonderful. I am in California now. I grew up in New Jersey, though. Certainly have memories. If I can comment on what you were saying, Rick, I kind of gave you, there's certainly a lot more, and it's an ongoing process.
Of course it is. Yeah.
It's when I tried so hard when I went back to school at McGill afterwards to find um, a position that I felt comfortable in on the East Coast. And I interviewed at dozens of places. And I think that as a sort of a tail end baby boomer, as a woman, I was experiencing a really bad mix of ageism and sexism.
Mm-hmm.
In one of the positions that I had interviewed for, the one who was doing the hiring said to me, "Well, it's interesting. Why did you choose to leave law, and why did you choose to go this route?" Actually, we're kind of looking for someone that we might be able to shape and mold, which was a way of saying you're too old, and we want somebody fresh and young. It was definitely age discrimination, and I dare say they probably would not have said that to, well, maybe they would have said it to a man, but my experiences in other places where I lived in one spot where one of the ethicists at the hospital told myself and another ethicist that we should not be walking around without stockings on our legs. It was hot. It was summer. We didn't have stockings. We had bare legs, and yeah, and we were told that's not appropriate. You need to put stockings on. And this is the 90s. The 90s. Or I was told that I wasn't keeping my place. I wasn't being deferential enough. Wow. Not being deferential enough actually got me blacklisted in a few places because I had the guts to stand up and push back on certain things, but then I was no longer invited to the conversation. Now, this is all discouraged, but I have to tell you, when my husband and I moved out to California in 2013, maybe it was just timing, luck. I found such a wonderful community here, including people like you, Rick, where it's like, no, we want to hear your story and we value what you have to say. And I feel just so fortunate that I found not one, but a couple of communities that, they're looking either beyond the age, or they don't seem to necessarily, they don't see my gender as a hindrance. And here I'm pushing 70, my 60, just really a few years ago, that I kind of felt like, oh, wow, now I have the strength, wisdom, and the community support.
Just to interrupt you briefly. Yeah, just to interrupt you very briefly, your sound quality is deteriorating. I don't know, your visual image is coming, stuck, is getting stuck, and sometimes
I thought it was
it's
from my
difficult to
side,
hear.
but yeah, I experienced the same thing. Rick.
Yeah, just to let you know, I don't know whether it might be easier to turn off your visual to see whether that improves the audio. Sometimes it's signal strength. I don't know, but that's fine. We can start. Okay, we'll see how that goes, and we'll let you know if it improves.
All right, thank you.
But no, I just just listening from what you're telling me, there's a lot of things that get buried in people's stories, and it never sees the light of day. And to me, there's an inequity in that itself. And so, as a describe myself as an equity muse is to inspire people to think about, maybe they should, think about, how can they retell their personal and professional stories in ways which enables us to become more effective at dealing with or promoting equity. I mean, what you just described in some respects was a beautiful example of that, but it takes years to get there. Well, if somebody hears your story and gets inspired by it, it might be that they might be able to not learn more effectively how to do it, but perhaps the timeline might be shortened in how they can address that. But I just wanted to leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, will often share this with my students, but you make a good point. It might be worth it to write it up.
Well, having written up stories like that, where instead of coming in and telling the story, people read the story in advance. It could be just a few pages. It could be longer, depending on how much detail you want. But it becomes a launching pad for having discussions with the author of the story. Because I think it's through that, not just the storytelling, but it's the dialogue. It's the dialogue before telling the story and the dialogue afterwards that allows people to create more of a learning community around equity. And I think it's so critically important to create platforms where that is allowed and encouraged. Hassan, do you have anything you'd like to add? I do have one question. I'd like to go back to Linda. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Because you're obviously an advocate for equity, and I might ask you, where did your sense of equity come from?
No, honestly, the reason I hopped on board is I really wanted to be amused, and I think I am amused by this narrative, by these stories from Linda and you and Andrew, that you just want an equitable life,
a fair world,
and
yeah, exactly.
And in fact, it's not fair. Everyone knows that it's just not a fair world. You have to be really competent at whatever you're doing in order to navigate these hardships and these hurdles that everyone has. Everyone's going through.
Well, that's actually, I put something in the text there, in the chat box about what equity governance is, which you've probably read. But I just want to tell a brief story myself, actually, because it was so happened last week when Lisa was chatting. I described it as the golden rule, and she said, "Well, there is the platinum rule." And as soon as she said that, I knew immediately that I had framed it wrong. And so I did a Google search, and I wanted to find out what was the most precious metal. I had no idea what it was, by the way. So I went to ChatGPT-4 and said, what are the costs of the most expensive precious metals? And interesting enough, rhodium, according, if this is correct, of course, you always have to verify everything on anything on artificial intelligence, but it said it costs $17,000 an ounce. And gold is $1,700, and platinum, which you think is more valuable, was $900. Again, verify these facts. Never trust one source. But what it did was it made me think, okay, I decided to come up with the rhodium rule of equity, which is the thing about the golden and the platinum rule. Both of those are individually focused, or they're focused on our interpersonal or interbeing relationships. But that's a very reductionist focus. So the actual rhodium rule is to be fair and kind to all people, the planet, the environment, nature, biodiversity, animals, the soil, and plants. And you might ask, why is that so easy to say, but so difficult to do? And to me, that's what we should be focusing our attention on, is how to help people learn more effectively in how to cultivate equity. And I asked Linda earlier, and she was a little sort of thinking, I don't know where to begin, but I was asking her, one of the things that I like to try and set up, and we can only set this up very briefly, but it takes longer than we have time for, is for people to either compose their own complex question about equity, or read the blog post, which is there, which has a long list of things, and pick out the question that you feel called to speak to, but not respond to, but to actually take the time to understand what it means, explain what it means to you, and invite others to do the same, because we can all have the same question, but we have different lenses or different interpretations. And if we don't understand the underlying implicit assumptions we take to a question before embarking on a dialogue, then it's going to take some while to sort of get in sync or resonate. And I just want to put one little plug in here, because I just came back from a brief vacation in Asheville, and I went to a local play that was called What the Constitution Means to Me. I won't go into the details of it, but at the very end of it, they had a debate, and the debate was keep the Constitution or get rid of it. And my response to this was, it was entertaining, but I thought this is futile. We need to get out of the debating framework with dealing complex problems, because debates don't solve things. They help you develop your critical thinking skills, but they don't solve complex problems. And so my sort of retort to it is, well, how can we enhance the amazing virtues of the constitutions and address the moral hypocrisies of failing to implement them? Which is a different way of doing it. Now, we need to upgrade. What I said, upgrade the Constitution. It's really upgrading the implementation of the Constitution. Constitutional amendments are almost impossible to make, but there are lots of little things you can do that can help to promote equity. But on that note, if you feel like just responding to what I just said, or think of a question, because we can take this conversation any way we like.
Well, I think you bring up such an important point here, and one of the things that I think this is a question I would add, because it's an implicit worldview, or there's a worldview that a lot of people have been operating from that really is no longer valid, in the sense that many people were taught this very hierarchical perspective that, you have man on top of the food chain, and the man, and it's very middle age, not middle age, I'm sorry, from the Middle Ages, the notion that the earth was the center of the universe, and that humanity was the center, was the that humanity was the ruler, not necessarily the steward. Although I think that many places are and religions and individuals are recognizing it's not about dominance; it's about stewardship. So, and what's happened is, built into our system, into the very language of our system, into the laws and everything, is this notion of person versus property. And if you have property, you have no rights. Okay. And only supposedly humans can be persons. Oh, but wait, no, corporations can be too, because of legal fictions. So to me, it's one of the questions I think need to be asking is, how do we get people to recognize that this old worldview is no longer valid, and that we are part of a really complex, interconnected system, and that we have responsibilities not just even to humanity, but to the rest of the planet. So that's to me, the question is, how do we help change the worldview from a hierarchical one to a more holistic one? And Rick, in my signature line, I have a little picture: eco versus ego, or ego versus eco. I don't know if you've seen it.
Right. I have. Yeah.
But yeah. So it's basically saying, all right, instead of recognizing that we were given the earth and can do whatever with it we want. Yeah, how's that working out for us? That's led to some of the crises we're in now. To how do we manage this interconnected, complex system in a loving and respectful way. Because
Well,
once people realize
I
they're not. Go ahead.
well, no,
Sorry.
I just changed my screen because I just read this article. It's called "Why Seek Self-Actualization," and it's actually a relatively short article from Helen de Cruz, who's a professor of philosophy at Danford Chair in Humanities in St. Louis University. And
Cool.
interesting enough, there's a sort of dichotomy in the medieval times, because on the one hand, you had the discovery doctrine on the one hand, which is, has left a long legacy of white supremacy, as you well know. But on the other hand, she talks about Spinoza and his philosophy, which was different. And interesting enough, highlights a Norwegian philosopher who I've never heard of before, called Arne Næss, who was deeply influenced by Spinoza's philosophy. So I've put it in the link there, actually, because it touches on many of the points you just made. To me, it speaks to storytelling, which stories get elevated and told, and which stories, like, Spinoza's, how well do people know about his story and his philosophy and how he influenced this Norwegian philosopher. And so this comes back full circle to the notion of, well, how can we tell better stories in such a way that we can work towards co-elevating the virtue of equity and the issue of fairness? So I think it's something that I just happened to come across, and you triggered me to share that. So you might enjoy looking at that. But we should
enjoy looking.
Yeah, it's a really nice article, actually, and it talks about a Norwegian philosopher that's not really well known. But his philosophy, everything he's talking about, is really very much in sync. Sometimes you discover things. How much is new in the universe? Not much. There's variations of a theme, and people have said this before. But what's lacking, I think, is that we're not very good at in our learning systems of how to create story movements where a lot of these things get buried and don't see the light of day. So my encouragement to Linda is think about writing up that story. I'd love to read that story and even see how your students respond to the story and how that helps to co-create new dialogues about your life experiences, because there's so much they could learn from you.
Thank you so much. Rick, I need to leave because I have to get to class at 10:30. But it's been a pleasure,
no
and I look forward to talking to you again soon. And great to meet you, and Andrew and Hassan. Please say hi to David for me.
I certainly will. Thank you very much for Hassan for showing up, and
thank you.
There'll be a session next week as well. Okay, have a good day.
Okay.
Bye now.